I fear not the dark itself, but what may lurk within it. Welcome to Lurk, bringing you creepy, strange, and bone-chilling stories, with your host, Jamie Jackson.
Hey Lurkers, it's Jamie. Welcome to episode 26. This episode, we are going to be discussing haunted Baltimore bars. Before we get into the episode, I wanted to touch upon the recent Sasquatch Calling Festival in Whitehall, New York. I recently attended that this past Saturday, September 25th. I went up there with my sometimes guest co-host, Angelina, and also with Liz, who runs the So Sci-Fi and Beyond that I have mentioned in previous episodes. And we both had booths set up and I spoke for a little bit. Absolutely excellent festival. It was fantastic. There were 75 vendors. There was a beer garden set up further down from where we were. I did not get to go to the beer garden, unfortunately. I was so busy. There's a calling festival. There were several different Bigfoot experts there talking about hunting for Bigfoot and different Bigfoot type topics. I did not get to listen to anybody. I went down, did my 40 minutes, and then had to rush back, and we were pretty much swamped most of the day, which was awesome. Sold out of pretty much everything that I took. I only have a few t-shirts left and one hoodie. I just wanted to say that next year, if you're able to, put it on your calendar. It is definitely something that I would recommend. All of the people who volunteered at the event were super nice. They were amazing, very helpful. It was very well organized, and everybody that we talked to, and we talked to a lot of people, everybody we talked to was just so friendly, so interested in everything. And so shout out to everybody that spoke to us at our booth. I appreciate all of you. I hope all of you take a moment to listen. Send me an email, stay in touch. If you have any ideas on show topics or if you have any feedback on shows, please don't hesitate to send me a message. But thank you so much for stopping by and talking to us. It was a really awesome time. So with that out of the way, we are going to be discussing Baltimore bars and their ghosts. This topic kind of came to be because I have a connection to one of the ghosts that haunts one of the bars in Baltimore. I know that sounds kind of strange, but it was this connection that I have that brought about this topic. The story of that one particular bar is nowhere near long enough to actually have an entire episode. I figured I would just include bars from the Baltimore area. Most of what I'm going to talk about is going to center around the area of Fells Point, and I'm going to save the one bar that, as I said, I had the connection to. I'm going to save that for last. I want to give a little bit of background into Baltimore and its history and a little bit about Fells Point. I won't dwell too much on that, but a lot of times the history of a place is the reason why it's haunted. So Baltimore was first established in 1729, and it was created as a port for shipping tobacco and grain. It was a pretty busy seaport and a shipbuilding center at the start of the Revolutionary War, and the U.S. Navy's first ship, the Constellation, was launched there in 1797. There is a ship called the USS Constellation that is moored there at the Baltimore Inner Harbor. It's not the same ship. Baltimore is located in the north central area of Maryland. It's about 40 miles northeast of Washington, D.C. There's a ton of history in Baltimore, and there's lots of ghost stories. Fells Point is an area that is known for its bars. I went there years ago when I was in college. I actually went with Angelina and a couple other people that we were friends with at the time. It was a really cool place to go. Fells Point itself was established in 1763. Its shipyards were best known for producing schooners that were great for blockade running. They were used by privateers during the War of 1812, and there were dozens of privateers who operated out of Fells Point, and they preyed on the British ships. There was also a yellow fever outbreak in 1794 and in 1800. Though there were more outbreaks than that, but those were the two worst that happened. Fells Point always seemed to be hit the hardest in those outbreaks. In 1794, there were 25 people on average that died each day. In 1800, the outbreak lasted 65 days from August until the first frost of the year, and there were nearly 900 deaths, and half of those were in Fells Point. There is a myth that there's a mass grave at the square at Fells Point. Because people died so fast, the bodies piled up so quickly, they just dumped them in there. But there's really no basis or evidence that that's actually honest truth. A Dr. Nathaniel Potter said that, who was a doctor at the time of the outbreak, said that he saw evidence of bodies being secretly buried, which would mean also illegally. There was no mass grave evidence, but there were reports of 1 or 2 bodies being buried during the night. So what most likely happened was that you had people who were running boarding houses. There were a lot of sailors that would come in and stay at port while their ship was there. And you'd have other boarders, and they would get sick, and they would die, and then you're left with the body of somebody you aren't related to, don't know, and they're from some totally different area. And the theory is that there were probably a couple times where there were bodies taken and buried in local parks or vacant lots or things like that because they didn't want to incur the cost of burying somebody they didn't really know. There were also, in addition to the yellow fever outbreak, it was also hard hit by the Spanish flu pandemic that happened after World War I. And that area, the Fells Point area, was the hardest hit in the Baltimore area. So that's a little bit of the history behind the area itself. A lot of death just in those different diseases, in the yellow fever and in the Spanish flu pandemic. There were a lot of deaths associated with both of those. So the first place I'm going to talk about is called the Admiral Fell Inn, and it is located in Fells Point. It is composed of 8 interconnected pre-existing buildings and a 3-story addition. The oldest building dated back to 1770, and then the remaining other 7 buildings date between 1791 and 1890. Most of these buildings had shops on their first floor, and then they had living quarters above on the upper floors. In 1881, the Port Mission Women's Auxiliary opened up a boarding house at the property, and it was to maintain under Christian influence a boarding house for seamen, a home away from home, a social recreational center where the seafarer might find safe refuge while in port. December 3rd, 1900, the central building opened, and it was called the Anchorage. It had a restaurant, a reading room, lobby, and dormitories that could accommodate up to 150 sailors. In 1918, the building opened to care for those suffering from the Spanish flu. So similar to today, I mean, it's a little bit easier to kind of understand a pandemic when you've dealt with one. And I'm not comparing COVID to the Spanish flu by any stretch of the imagination. So the hospitals were inundated, and the Anchorage, that was a boarding house, opened its rooms up to bring in those who were sick with the Spanish flu. And they actually had hundreds that died there, and that included at least 6 of the nurses that were taking care of those who were ill. During the 1900s, Fells Point was also at this time a very rough waterfront neighborhood. There were a lot of warehouses, saloons, illegal gambling halls, mobster hangouts, and brothels. And at one point, the Anchorage was converted to serve as a boarding house and a theater for ladies of the night, sailors, and immigrants. So it wasn't just for sailors, but also for some potentially undesirables, as they were referred to back then. 1929, the YMCA opened at the site, and it closed in 1955. Eventually, the property became a vinegar bottling plant. In 1985, that's when the Admiral Fell Inn opened as a 38-room bed and breakfast. In 1996, there were upgrades done to it, and it turned it into an 80-room hotel, which is the way it is currently. The inn is considered one of the most haunted hotels in the state of Maryland. It's no wonder, since there were so many deaths on the property. You had those who were sick, you had supposed mob victims, and there was even one sailor that shot himself on hotel property, according to the Sun, which is now called the Baltimore Sun. Guests have reported seeing floating sailors where there used to be a fire escape stairs, and butlers who knock on their hotel room doors, but when they open the door, there's nobody there. In one second floor room, there was somebody who was staying in the room, and he was staying there with his dog, and the dog woke the man up several times, barking and scratching at the frame of the window. The man finally decided to see what was going on. He got up, goes to look out the window, and he sees a man dressed as a 19th century sailor who's sitting out there on the window ledge. The sailor turns, looks at the man, and then vanishes. Another encounter, there was a guest in room 218 who was considered pretty skeptical of the paranormal. One night he woke up to the sound of creaking floorboards in his room, and when he looked up, there, standing at the foot of his bed, was a woman holding what looked like a medical chart, and she was making notations, like she was writing down information on a medical chart. She looked up at him, and then she looked back down at the chart, and then she turned and walked through the wall of the room. He pretty much thought, I must be dreaming. He couldn't get out of his head, so he ends up going to the front desk and asks the hotel manager on duty what might be going on. So she says, hey, we've got these photo books. Why don't you go check out these photo books? So he's flipping through these books, and he actually ends up being able to identify the woman that he saw at the foot of the bed as a woman who worked there as a nurse, and her photo was actually in one of the books. She worked there as a nurse during the Spanish flu epidemic, and more than likely was one of the victims. Some of the ghosts that are seen tend to play tricks on the guests by setting off alarm clocks at odd times in the middle of the night. One guest heard footsteps and saw a woman walk through the wall before telling him to lie back down. There's also a ghost of a woman who enters your room, sits on your bed, and stares at you while you're sleeping. And when you wake up, she shushes you and tells you to go back to sleep. I'm not really sure that anybody would be able to go back to sleep at that point. I know I certainly wouldn't be able to. Sometimes guests call the front desk and complain about loud partying that's going on in the room next to them, only to learn that the room is actually empty and there's nobody there. In September of 2003, during Hurricane Isabel, the guests of the inn were evacuated to safety. Isabel was a pretty nasty storm that kind of was a direct hit to that area. The manager and a few other employees opted to stay behind in the lobby and wait out the storm just to make sure everything was okay. And during the evening, the group went for dinner but left the assistant manager in the lobby to keep an eye out for things, listen for the phone. When they returned, the manager reported that he heard a lot of noise, like footsteps and loud talking, in the rooms directly above the lobby. But when he went to investigate, the rooms were empty and undisturbed. The following evening, another manager reported the same phenomena and added that he could see the ceiling above vibrate with the pounding of dancing feet. It was one heck of a party, and apparently the staff still kind of joke that the ghost took advantage of the empty building to throw a hurricane party. There's one account by 2 hotel guests that reported, when we checked into here, we discovered that every drawer in our room was open. 2 nightstands, a chest of drawers, every single one. We called the desk clerk about this, and he assured us that housekeeping would have never left the room like that. They pretty much dismissed it, closed the drawers, went out to dinner. When they came back later that night, they were completely surprised to see that when they went into the room, all the drawers and the cupboard doors were now wide open. They called to the desk, asked about housekeeping to see if they had come in the room, and of course, no one had actually been to the room and housekeeping had left for the day. According to the guests, when they learned this, they immediately requested to have a different room. There's a specific room in the hotel that is said to be quite haunted. That's room 413. Now, this room was the scene of a horrific murder, which actually didn't happen too long ago in 1999. That's 22 years ago. There was a man who was attending a pharmaceutical convention at the hotel. His name was Chris Jones. He was stalked and killed by a man named Gary Mick. And Gary Mick was a homophobe. Chris Jones was a gay man. And Gary Mick followed him to the room and ended up bashing in Chris Jones's head with a hammer claw. Gary Mick was able to be caught when he found his next victim and tried to attack him, and the man was able to escape and to identify him. But hotel housekeepers get strange feelings when they clean the room, and others refuse to go into it at all. Some people feel a breeze or a hand resting on their shoulder. Others have experienced cold spots and shadows darting around the room. I know I said this was an episode on haunted Baltimore bars, and I am getting to that. The Admiral Fell Inn has a tavern down in the basement. It's the oldest part of the hotel, and some say it's the most paranormally active. There was an incident where ice cube trays were moved from the freezer and then found in various different refrigerators. There's a photo of what looks like a woman outside the tavern's window. Light bulbs flicker, and that's usually an indication that something paranormal is about to happen. People hear sounds of evil laughter, glasses clinking, and gunshots. Those are all phenomena that are experienced at the tavern. And there's one story about another apparition of a nurse that was reported in the basement of the hotel. As I said, that's now the tavern. During the Spanish flu epidemic, the basement actually served as cold storage facilities, otherwise known as the morgue. Many people have reported seeing a woman wearing a white cap and apron or hearing brisk footsteps and the rustle of skirts in an empty room. One patron took a photo of the bar and was shocked to find there was a woman standing behind a display of ship models, and her dark uniform and nurse's cap were actually clearly visible. If you ever visit the tavern, you can ask about the photo. Apparently they have a copy there, and they are more than happy to share that with you. The next stop we're making is a building where a restaurant called Bertha's Mussels is located. The building was built in the late 1700s or early 1800s, and it was used as a brothel when Fells Point was a busy shipyard. Now, Bertha's Mussels is actually 3 interconnected buildings, and paranormal activity is so frequent that the employees were once required to sign a waiver acknowledging that Bertha's would not pay for therapy as a result of anything that they might see or hear on the property. People claim that some of the ghosts are victims of the yellow fever outbreaks or the flu pandemic. So as I said, those 2 different illnesses really play a part in just how haunted this area is. So Bertha's Mussels not only was the restaurant, but it also, prior to being a restaurant, was a dance studio. It had apartments in it. And in 1972, it became the Lone Star Bar and then eventually became Bertha's Mussels. In addition to signing the waiver, the management actually warns new hires, or at least they did at one time. They warned new hires of the paranormal activity, and no one was allowed to go to the fourth floor alone. One night, it was incredibly busy in the restaurant and bar, and there was an employee who needed to go upstairs to get something because the 4th floor was a storage area, and he was not able to find anybody who could actually walk up there with him. So he decided, the heck with it, I'm just going to go get what I need. It's silly to try to wait for somebody when you're that busy and you need something. So as he went up the stairs, he started to feel as though he was not wanted. He shrugged it off, continued to go upstairs. He opened the door to the storage room, but instead of seeing the shelving and equipment and the items that were stored there, he saw a rocking chair and a bed, and then he saw a girl playing in the corner with her back to him. He made some sort of noise, probably out of complete shock at what he was seeing, and the girl turned, and he realized that she had no face. He ran down the stairs, screaming, and out onto the street, and he never came back to work there again. Another person saw a young girl in braids jumping rope on the 2nd floor landing. She was eventually tentatively identified as the daughter of a prostitute that died in a typhus outbreak in 1853. In the area of the bar and the dining room, items have moved on the tables. Hair combs, pins are taking out of ladies' hairs and they're put next to the drinks. People have seen faces in the mirrors there at the restaurant. One bartender was closing up for the night and was walking through the dining room when she saw the figure of an old man in a worn derby hat and old clothes. He tipped his hat at her and then vanished. She left in a hurry, and then the next day she mentioned what she had seen to another co-worker who had worked there longer than she had, and the co-worker's like, "Oh yeah, he's been seen several times before." There's another ghost that is seen often, and that's a woman in a black cloak. She was seen in the mirror in the room that used to be part of the old dance studio. There was a worker who walked through the room around 6 a.m. and saw the woman in the mirror dressed in black and wearing a large hat. The worker thought it was an actual reflection of a person, but no one else was there. There's also a man in a large hat and a dark cloak that's been seen standing on nearby steps. And then there was a customer who was using the bathroom, and she reported she heard a woman talking to her, but when she came out of the stall, she discovered there was actually nobody else there in the bathroom with her. There's also a ghost called the Tall Man. He's been seen on security monitors and on the stairs. Paranormal investigators have even captured photos of what they believe is ectoplasm on the stairs where he's been seen. And by ectoplasm, I'm not talking slime or slime. I'm talking more than likely the photos have some sort of foggy, misty looking stuff in the photo. I haven't seen the photos. I'm just giving you my opinion of what they're probably referring to as ectoplasm. There have been sightings of a man smoking a pipe dressed in 19th century clothing in the dining room, and many people report hearing strange sounds and disembodied voices. There was one out-of-town diner that was having lunch who asked the waiter if the place was haunted, and the waiter replied, "This whole neighborhood is haunted. This is the most haunted part of town." The customer pointed to a nearby table, table number 5, and said he had seen an older man dressed in overalls with a beard smoking a pipe. The man looked like a fisherman, and when another customer walked by the table, the man just completely vanished. There's actually a photo associated with Bertha's. Some people took a photo of the building, and it seems to show the ghost of a girl. And I will make sure I get that photo. It's on the internet. I'll make sure I get a copy of that and post it to the social media so that you can check that out. So we're going to move over to the Whistling Oyster, which is another bar in Fells Point. It's also host to some unexplained phenomena. The oldest section of the building that houses the Whistling Oyster dates back to the 1760s, and some of the owners back then were also slave owners. One time a customer reported seeing a black man dressed in colonial-era clothing and sweeping an area near the fireplace. In the area between the front bar and the back room stands a storage closet. Originally, there was actually a staircase that was there, but it has been since taken down. People often hear footsteps as though someone is walking up the stairs, though as I said, it had been removed several years before. Another time, there was an ash bucket that appeared in the aisle by the fireplace. It was moved to the side only for it to end up back in the middle of the aisle. Every time it was moved out of the way, it would end up back in the middle of the walkway. And finally, no one even wanted to touch it anymore, and they left it there. The Cat's Eye Pub is another haunted bar located in the Fells Point area of Baltimore. It's a popular Irish bar, and it's known for its infamous Wall of Death that features photos of deceased workers and well-known customers that they've hung in dedication. And there are some who think that some of those people featured in those photos are actually still in the bar today. The building that houses the Cat's Eye Pub operated as a brothel in the 1700s, and it was part of Fells Point's red light district. And that area, red light district, would be an area where prostitutes tend to be working. It was purchased in 1975 by a gentleman named Kenny, who was well known for pulling pranks and goofing off at the bar with his friend and bartender Jeff Knapp. Kenny owned the pub until he died in 1987. One of the ghost stories of the Cat's Eye Pub is a reminder of what the bar used to be. When the building was purchased and renovated to become a bar, one thing that was noticed was all of the light switches that were once used for the red lights. What would happen is that a prostitute would turn the light off if she was not available, and if she was available for another customer, she would turn the light on. So when it was renovated, the construction workers put up drywall over the switches since they weren't being used anymore. Customers and workers today often hear the sound of the switches being turned on and off behind the walls. Prostitutes aren't the only ones that are still working after their death. The former owner Kenny and his bartender sidekick Jeff are still overseeing the pub. There was a woman one time who was in the bar talking about the former owner, Kenny, and she was talking kind of negatively about him, when his photo flew off the wall of death and hit her in the head. Another story is that a woman came in to the bar and asked to purchase a shirt from the bartender who was working there. A few days later, she returned and was looking for the same bartender. After describing him to another worker, they showed her the wall of death, and there she recognized Jeff Knapp's picture and told them that that was who sold her the shirt. The only problem was Jeff had passed away in 1992. One of the bartenders at the Cat's Eye pub has reported that she's seen several different weird things over her 25 years since she's worked there. Glasses have come flying off the wooden shelves, buckets have jumped off of soda machines, and harmonicas have appeared out of thin air. There is an account from a woman who said that sometime around 1990, she walked up the uneven steps, opened the door, stepped into the bar, and was forced to stop in her tracks because there were two bodies on the floor. A man and a woman, completely motionless, holding each other in an embrace. After a moment, the woman realized that the embrace meant that they were either having the most intense kiss ever, or they were unconscious from too much alcohol, or they were dead. So the woman froze and then realized that there were people at the bar and none of them were panicking. No one seemed to even notice that these two people laying on the floor. Nobody even seemed to understand. They were kind of perplexed about why she had just stopped there in the open doorway. So she just put a smile on her face, stepped over the two bodies, and she said she didn't look down to see if they were breathing. Other customers followed her in, and they too had no concern, didn't break stride. They stepped over the pair, who remained locked in a motionless embrace. So that brings us to the establishment known as the Horse You Rode In On Saloon. The building was built in 1775, and it was actually built on land that was once a part of the Fells Prospect, which was the estate of William Fell, who was the founder of Fells Point. It is considered America's oldest continually operated saloon. It is also the only bar in Maryland to exist before, during, and after Prohibition. For those of you who don't know, Prohibition was a time frame in United States history where you were not allowed to make, sell, or transport alcoholic beverages. It was built as Allen Ann's in 1775, and it catered to miscreants, sailors, and shipbuilders. In 1972, it was purchased by Howard Gerber, who is the person who renamed it the Horse You Rode In On Saloon. It's actually said that he won big at the Pimlico racetrack, and that's how he ended up with the money for the place, and that's how he ended up picking the name The Horse You Rode In On. Later in 2006, the property was sold at auction, but they kept the name. The Horse You Rode In On Saloon, or The Horse as it's affectionately called, is considered to be the last stop of Edgar Allan Poe. And hopefully everybody who's listening to this podcast knows who Edgar Allan Poe is. He is a writer, basically. He's written short stories and he's written poetry. Very famous, very creepy. I love Edgar Allan Poe. So Edgar Allan Poe is said to have stopped here at the Horse right before he was found delirious on the street. Now, we actually have the anniversary of that coming up here on the 3rd, which is Sunday. The 3rd is the day that Poe was found on the street. And when he was found, it actually was said that he was found in clothing that was really ratty and ill-fitting, and the shoes were really worn. And that wasn't typically how he dressed. He usually was dressed pretty smartly. So there's a lot of speculation as to what happened to Poe. Some say he had an alcohol problem off and on. And some say that he just drank too much and that's what made him delirious. I don't want to go too much into that because that's probably going to be some sort of episode down the road. He ended up dying on the 7th of October. He's also said to frequent the Horse You Rode In On Saloon. There is one story of a 15-year-old whose uncle owned the bar. He was staying there at the bar and he had gone up to bed. And while he was asleep, he woke up because he heard heavy footsteps coming up the stairs. He actually thought it was his uncle, the bar owner, so he calls out a greeting to him. The footsteps continued and then stopped when they got to his door. He yells out, "Come in, I've got something to ask you." But he gets no reply. So he yells out again, "Hey, I got something to ask you, come in." Again, there's no reply. He then heard whoever it was outside of his door turn on their heel and go back down the hallway to climb the stairs to the 3rd floor, and he heard the door up there open and close. He thought maybe his uncle had a little bit too much to drink, and so he gets out of bed, goes upstairs to make sure his uncle can give him a ride home the next day, because obviously at 15 he can't drive. And when he goes up, he finds that the door is locked. So he ends up going to get the key, because he has a key to the door. He goes to get the key, and he can still hear movement. While he's getting the key out of his room on the 2nd floor, he can hear movement up on the 3rd floor and what sounds like a man's voice. So he goes back and he knocks. And the instant he knocks, the sounds stop instantly. He goes in and he looks through all the rooms. Nobody is there. There's no one in there at all. So he starts to head back down to his room, and he meets his uncle, who is now coming up. And he tells his uncle what happened, and he just laughs and says, "Well, I guess you just met Edgar." Everybody refers to the ghost as Edgar because obviously this was quite possibly the last stop for Edgar Allan Poe before he ended up dying. There are other stories of voices coming from empty areas of the main room at the horse on quiet nights. There are cold spots, flickering lights, weird cell phone behavior like people get odd text messages, or the battery drains mysteriously. And that's something I've actually experienced in different haunted locations where ghosts want to pull from whatever energy they can. So whether it's pulling heat, because heat is energy, whether they're pulling the heat from the room, which would create a cold spot, or they're pulling energy from your batteries. I have put fresh, brand new batteries in a camera or a recording device, tried to use it, and they are completely dead. And by new batteries, I mean I opened the pack right there while I was on site. So that's actually something that's quite common that happens, is that batteries of any type get drained. It also seems that the ghosts that are there at the horse get upset if you question their existence. There have been people who have made comments like, "Oh, there's no such thing as ghosts." And when that happens, it seems like the ghosts tend to pull your bar stool out from underneath of you, or your drink goes flying off the table. There's a gentleman in a black coat and knee breeches that's seen at the rear of the property just outside the fence that surrounds a nearby graveyard and in the building itself. This is actually thought to be William Fell, whose property the tavern is built on, and who founded Fell's Point. So there's one story where there was a glass sitting on the bar top that unexpectedly shattered. No one was near it. Nothing fell on it. It just shattered while it was sitting there. The manager noticed that there was another employee that had also just witnessed the glass shattering who looked pale. When questioned, the employee showed the manager a photo of a shattered glass. Apparently, another glass in the exact same area of the bar had shattered the evening before without any explanation. Another night when the manager was there alone, he was convinced he saw someone walk by him. He was so convinced he actually said, "Hey, we're not open yet, you can't be in here," but there was no one else there. The desk drawers in the office open and close on their own. There's been floating orbs that have been seen above the bar. No one wants to go up to the 4th floor attic. And as Edgar Allan Poe is said to have been, this was his last stop before he ultimately died, his ghost is often seen walking down the street towards the saloon. The ghost, Edgar, is named for the famous Edgar Allan Poe, and he has a designated seat at the bar. Bartenders always leave a glass of cognac, which was Poe's drink of choice, on the bar top for their most famous ghost. It's said Poe's ghost is known to drink the cognac from the glass, as many times there's liquid missing by the end of the night. He's also said to be responsible for swinging the chandelier and opening the cash register drawer. Now, the chandelier actually sometimes swings back and forth so dramatically and violently that you automatically assume there must be some sort of vibration or something going on the floor above. But there's no vibration, there's no wind, there's no reason for it to move at all. The Food Network actually named the Horse You Rode In On Saloon as the most haunted restaurant in America. Next, we're going to move about 3 miles away from Fells Point to the area of Charles Street, and the first of 2 haunted bars in this location. The first one I'm going to talk about is the Zodiac Club, and the Zodiac has a sister club called Club Charles. Typically, everybody usually talks about Club Charles first. We're going to talk about Club Charles last because that is the one that I have a connection to. So the Zodiac Club was owned by Joy Martin, and it boasted a Cajun-inspired menu. The ghost associated with the Zodiac is a dark and sinister one. He always sits at table 3, sometimes with a dog, other times with a drink and a smoke. Waiters go over to wait on him, only to have him vanish when they return with a menu. He's said to be a dapper man dressed in a white linen suit. Employees claim he gives them an eerie feeling, and they always feel as though they're being watched. He's also known to be violent towards employees. One employee was on the 3rd floor when they were shoved out of the door and heard a voice yell, "Get out," right before the door was slammed in their face. The owner was actually pushed down the steps, and that resulted in her breaking her wrist. The History Channel went to the Zodiac to film Haunted History, and while they were there, one of their crew members was actually locked in the bathroom. The building that houses the Zodiac was once a speakeasy during Prohibition. Now, a speakeasy was a place where it was like a secret bar. You went there to get alcohol that you weren't supposed to be getting. So the man who owned the speakeasy was named McKim, and McKim actually died in the basement of the building. He hung himself after he believed his wife was getting ready to leave him. The Zodiac closed in 2008 when workers severed a gas line. It opened again in 2013 as a comedy club, but it's now permanently closed. And that brings us to, finally, the ghost at the Club Charles. This is the story that had me putting together this entire episode on haunted Baltimore bars, because this story is near and dear to me, and it's part of my family's history. I've mentioned before that genealogy is another one of my hobbies, and I have a file on my computer of various family photos that my dad gave me. They're old photos that he got from, like my grandmother, and that my aunts compiled, whatever photos. They've been scanned from the original and saved on the computer. So there are a couple photos that include my grandfather, my great uncle, a horse, and a man in black pants, black jacket, black tie, and a white shirt. My aunt identified the man as a good friend of my grandfather's and great uncle's named Frenchie. I will make sure that I share these photos on the social media account so that you can see them. And I'll also make sure I include a link to the blog post that I did about this specific story in the show notes. So, one day, my aunt and cousin are watching History's Mysteries about Baltimore when the episode is discussing the ghost at the Club Charles. They show a photo of the man who was believed to be the ghost, and my aunt yells out, "That's Frenchie!" My cousin right away lets me know about this interesting development. Someone who was a friend of our grandfather, who we have photos of, is now a famous ghost in a bar in Maryland. It's the stuff of dreams for a couple of gals into paranormal and genealogy. I mean, there's nothing better, folks. If you like genealogy and you love your family history and you are super invested in the paranormal and have been for your entire life, there is absolutely nothing better than finding out during genealogy that your grandfather's really good friend is now the ghost at the bar in Baltimore that they've actually made television shows about. So I remembered one time that my grandmother mentioned something about a friend of my grandfather's being a ghost at a bar in Baltimore. Honestly, at the time, I didn't pay a whole lot of attention to what she said. I pretty much kind of forgot about it. I wasn't really sure what she was talking about, to be honest with you. Not that she didn't make sense, it didn't make sense to me, and I kind of was like, I don't really know what she's talking about. I think she's misspeaking. So I forgot about it. Fast forward a couple of decades, give or take, I found myself down in the city of Baltimore near the Zodiac Bar. These bars are actually located near what was called the Everyman Theater. The Everyman Theater has since moved from that location, but that's where I was going. I was going to the theater. We're standing in front of the Zodiac Bar, and somewhere in the deep dark recesses of my brain, I dredge out some vague memory of my grandmother talking about a ghost in a bar, and I thought the bar she mentioned was the Zodiac. Honestly, what happened, the Zodiac is the name that I remembered. And I remembered the Zodiac being the haunted bar because of the Zodiac Killer. That's really it, folks. That's the only reason why I was able to pull that memory out of my head. My brain works in very odd, strange ways. So I actually mentioned it to my companions, and that was my part in piecing together this puzzle. Maybe another decade passes, and my cousin says to me, after my aunt sees the History's Mysteries episode, Kelly says, "Hey, did you know Pop's friend Frenchie in that photo is the ghost featured on Haunted History?" I'm gonna start backtracking a little bit here and start at kind of the beginning. and tell you a story about a man named Edouard André Nate, who was born in France in 1925. One record has his date of birth listed as the 10th of October, 1925, and he died the 12th of May in 1980. During World War II, Edouard Nate is said to have acted as a double agent. He spied on the Nazis and reported his information to the French resistance. During my research, I found a World War II registration card for Edouard Nate for the District of Columbia, which is Washington, D.C., and there's no address information listed as a place of residence, though there is a hotel in France listed as his mailing address. His sister, a Mrs. Grisot, is listed as the person who will always know his address, and there is no registrant signature on the card. The lack of information seemed really odd because it's the first time I'd come across something like this. But of course I thought, well, maybe if he was acting as a spy, there would not be a whole lot of information about him. Later, in August of 1950, Edouard enlisted in the U.S. Army and he served in the Korean War. He was released from the military in August of 1952, and I assume that's the time he began his work as a waiter. His first job as a waiter was with Miller Brothers and eventually the Harvey House, where he worked for 20 years before his death in 1980. Sometime after his service, Edouard, or Frenchie, began frequenting the bar that would become the Club Charles. Frenchie would often join my grandfather and great uncle at the bar for drinks, and he also spent some time hanging out with them and their families. Originally, the bar was called the Wigwam, and it advertised grub and firewater. Frenchie lived in the apartment upstairs. Eventually, the owner of the bar, Esther Martin, renamed it the Club Charles. Frenchie was well known at the bar. He was there often after work, drinking at the bar, wearing his waiter's uniform of black pants, white shirt, tie, and vest, much like the photos that I have. He was known as a charmer with the ladies, and he was also a known prankster who enjoyed jovially messing with people. During Frenchie's time, there was a group of policemen and cab drivers who would meet to play a game of poker in the bar. When Frenchie would return from work, he had a habit of going over to the group and playfully tussling their hair and trying to sit in their laps. Sadly, Frenchie passed away in 1980 in his apartment above the bar from acute alcoholism, according to the stories. In his obituary, it says he was a friend of Mrs. Esther Martin, who was the owner of the bar. No other family is mentioned. But the spirit of Frenchie lives on. After his death, employees of the bar began seeing a man in a waiter's uniform that would suddenly disappear. Others have witnessed glasses moving off the shelf and floating in midair for a moment before landing on the floor unbroken and completely intact. Bottles move, and sometimes Frenchie turns on the beer tap. He also enjoys calling employees on a payphone that doesn't accept incoming calls. The phone continuously rings even after it's answered. There's also a story about how a group of people playing poker felt something pulling at their hair. One person got so frustrated they shot a bullet into the ceiling, yelling, "Damn it, French, leave us alone." There's no doubt that Frenchie hasn't left the Club Charles. I'm hoping one day in the near future I'll be able to visit and perhaps have a drink with my grandfather and great-uncle's old friend. So this is going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories from the city of Baltimore. As always, you can find us wherever you listen to your favorite podcast or always at lurkpodcast.com, where you'll find episodes as well as links to our social media. And as always, I recommend following one of those platforms. We also have merch at lurkpodcastmerch.com. The link is found in the show notes and on our Facebook page. And just in case there's anyone new to podcasts, show notes are part of the episode description. If you click on the read more on the episode description in whatever app you use, you'll find links to social media as well as any resources that I've used in an episode. Also, if you have a moment and your podcast app allows it, please consider giving us a review. We've been steadily growing our audience, but a 5-star review would go a long way in helping with that. So that does it for now. Thanks to all our loyal lurkers out there. And as always, keep lurking.